Good morning. Great to see everybody here. If you have a worksheet, we're at page 33. We're going to be starting there in just a moment. And I forgot to ask if there was any update on Brett. I assume he's landed. That means he still has a little bit of travel to go. So let's keep him in our prayers, especially if Leonard is driving. And we'll start on question number 8 this morning of lesson number 11. All right. So in, let's see. Oh, no problem. All right, so this will come up here in a moment, and we'll be on number 8. So the question is, after this statement, David would not stretch out his hand against the Lord's anointed. Contrast the activity of David with that of the first century Jews and Romans toward Christ. So kind of drawing the parallel that you have the Lord's anointed, contrast David's actions toward the Lord's anointed, and then even God's own people and the nations, the Romans, toward God's anointed in the New Testament.
One that stands out is they didn't recognize him as being anointed, whereas David did recognize Saul.
Very good. So there's that kind of failure to recognize him as the king, as the Lord's anointed. David, even with Saul beginning to spiral downward, still acknowledges this is his office. He is the Lord's anointed. I will not put my hand against him. What else?
David was humble. He was submissive. The Jews were anything but humble. They exalted themselves.
Exactly. Yeah. Over and over again, don't we see the pride that they manifest toward God's anointed?
I think the psalmist too of them plotting a vain thing that they would actually even dare to overthrow God's anointed. God himself, essentially.
Absolutely. Yeah, the kids and I, our family and I just read Psalm 2, and it is interesting, that contrast. And so you get to the exhortation there at the end of, you should be kissing or paying homage to the Son, and that's not what they do. And that reminds me, that quotation you bring up, Brother Trevor, is then quoted and in reference to the Jews and the Romans in the book of Acts. And so you see that kind of contrast, that they're fulfilling these prophecies. Not that God wanted them to act this way, but this is how they acted. Any other thoughts?
I just think in terms of David, he recognized Saul's unrighteousness and so forth, but he left it to the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And it was not his role to take that in hand. And I think about that from the standpoint of the illustration of Michael and the devil. The Lord rebuked you, and so even someone a being in that position would refuse to take in his own hands what is the Lord's responsibility. But here were Jews taking it in their own hand to rectify matters that were, even if Jesus was guilty, they really weren't in the position that they put themselves in.
Right. Very good. Yep. Very good. Any other thoughts? And then just the only thing I would add is just the even physical differences between David just barely cuts off a piece of his cloak and feels guilty, and here these people are slapping Jesus in the face, having him scourged, crucifying him. You have something that we would consider maybe not super shameful, cutting off the edge of his garment, and yet then in contrast you have the Jews and the Romans who should be bowing before their king, who are doing the most shameful things that are possible in the first century, especially crucifixion.
The difference in leadership as well. So David not only himself would touch the Lord's anointed, but he also made sure his men didn't touch the Lord's anointed, as opposed to Jewish leaders who conspired and had others lie against Christ.
Very good. And even instigating the people. Yeah, very good.
And along that lines, David was being persuaded by his own men to take Saul's life, and he did not give in to that pressure, as opposed to the Jews who stirred the crowd.
Right.
Used mob tactics to actually persuade the Romans to kill Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Any final thoughts on that? All right, then let's go on to section number 9 here. And let me just quickly mention, as we are at this section of 1 Samuel, I think we've already mentioned it, but there seems to be an allusion to Samuel being in the Hadean realm, even though it's not called Hades at this point. We get a little bit more insight into that in the New Testament, but I determined that that would probably take a little too much time. We're not going to dive in and talk about that at this point, but it does show that there was an acknowledgement of the soul had life after death in the Old Testament. All right, after he despoiled his enemies, David gave a portion of the plunder to his friends, the elders of Israel. What I'd like us to do is actually read 1 Samuel 30:26, and then I need a volunteer also for Ephesians 4:7 through 13, and let's see how does David's pillaging of the Lord's enemies foreshadow what Christ has done. So who wants to read the single verse there, 1 Samuel? All right, Brother Daniel's going to read that for us. And who's going to take the Ephesians 4 passage for us? All right, thank you, Jim. All right, so let's just read one after the other. Let's do 1 Samuel and then go right into Ephesians 4.
Now when David came to Ziklag, he sent some of the spoil to the elders. To the elders of Judah, to his friends, saying, Behold, a gift for you from the spoil of the enemies of the Lord.
Ephesians 4. But to each one of us grace was given according to the measure of Christ's gift. Therefore he says, when he ascended on high, he led captivity captive and gave gifts to men. Now this, he ascended, what does it mean but that he also first descended into the lower parts of the earth? He who descended is also the one who ascended far above all the heavens, that he might fill all things. And he himself gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, and some pastors and teachers, for the equipping of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ, till we all come to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to a perfect man, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ.
All right. Now, what I am not saying before we talk about this is that this is a direct allusion to what David did. But I think there might be some parallels between what David does and what Christ does. So do you see any parallels there? And if so, what would they be?
David is the one who risked life and limb and did what it took to defeat the enemies, but he shares the blessing of that with the people of God.
Very good. Excellent.
So
Go ahead.
Jesus doing the same.
Yeah, very good. What else?
There's a line, we were listening on the way here to the hymn, How Deep the Father's Love for Us. And the line in that, why should I gain from his reward? Speaks to that fact.
Very good. Any other thoughts?
Just bring in Isaiah 53:12 as well, that he would divide the booty with the strong. Is that allusion to he's victorious, but he's going to share the bounty of that victory.
Very good. And in this way, I think we can draw a line from David all the way through the prophets up to Christ, that whatever specific allusions we might have or foreshadowing we might have, in general, we do have David as being the warrior king who is going to be victorious through the strength of God and is then going to provide. And I think that same concept is true of Jesus as well. But whereas in the Old Testament it is a physical plundering, what happened? What is Ephesians 4 talking about? How did Jesus do that? How did he do it, and what did he do?
Died and went to the afterlife and came back.
Mm-hmm.
So he went, to the consequences of sin, we might say, which is death, but then came back, therefore, destroying the whole of death over mankind. And so, an enemy that has a stranglehold on us, and he defeated it.
Very good. Very good. And what gifts does he give to the church? After he has led captivity captive, after he has won this battle, and I think there's a theme throughout Ephesians that there's this battle in the heavenly places with the spiritual authorities, and I think Ephesians 4 references that. But what does he do when he is resurrected and ascends to heaven? He gives gifts to men. Now, what does he give? You have to kind of jump past the quotations to kind of pick up the rest of the verb there. But in verse 11, he gives something. Yeah, he gives these offices: apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. I think that the line of reasoning here is he has won, and now he is giving something to his people. What he gives is those who can equip them, and they begin doing the ministry, the service that they ought to do. And so there's this kind of mutual benefit that comes from Jesus sending his revelation, appointing certain ones to reveal it, and then the whole body grows from that. Any additional thoughts on any of that? There's some other New Testament passages that show Jesus as the despoiling warrior king, but we don't necessarily have time to dive into that. Yes, Brother Kevin.
Looking at it as a list of gifts Jesus gave, as opposed to a rigid hierarchy, does yield a different meaning to the verse. Because I've heard some people use this verse to say that evangelists are over pastors.
Yeah, I got so the order. Some people will assume a hierarchy there, right?
As opposed to realizing this is gifts.
Yeah.
Not a list of the order of the church.
Yes, very good. And of course, those that already have a certain hierarchy to their religious order are going to maybe see those things. But of course, I think you're right. These are gifts, and if there is any kind of order, it might just be in the order in which the gospel went forth, that you have apostles and prophets, and then you have evangelists, and then the establishing of pastors and teachers. There's different ways of looking at that, but I think it's kind of a whole. This body of people who are having something to do with the revelation of God are then equipping those, the congregations, the church, to do its service. Any other thoughts on that? All right. I'll quickly read the challenge, and then we'll move right into lesson number 12. Saul failed in many ways. David was not perfect, but he tried hard to do the will of God and to rectify some of the errors of his predecessor, for instance, the Amalekites. We cannot fix all the sins in this world. This is not our responsibility. But we can do the best we can in our sphere of influence. If some unresolved problem of your own doing or of someone else's doing exists that you can help resolve, schedule a time this week when you will take the first steps to correct the issue. So that's one application point I would draw from the contrast between Saul and David, is we can't do everything, but we can serve the purpose of God in our own generation as David did, Acts chapter 13. All right, let's move on to lesson number 12. Lesson number 12. This will be the new packet, and it's page 34. And we'll have the PowerPoint here up in a second. But we're still in the United Kingdom, but as we move into 2 Samuel, we're going to be focusing even more on David because we've had Saul's life ended at the end of 1 Samuel. And I label this David's triumphs and troubles. But as you read through the first 12 chapters of 2 Samuel, what did you kind of see as the theme, the focus of this section, chapters 1 through 12? King after God's own heart falls to temptation. So that kind of puts focus on there's some other things before it, but it does focus especially on the back end there at chapter 11. What else do you see here?
The solidification of the throne.
Mm-hmm.
Power and uniting.
Very good. And I went along a similar line there of God establishes the kingdom of his anointed is kind of a theme. Anybody see anything else as you were reading? All right. So we will look at each of these chapters in detail or overview in just a moment. But what we're going to do first, in focusing in on, as Brad pointed out, that you do have the failure of David. There is a song in our hymnal called Cleanse Me. It's 408 in Hymns for Worship. It's 22 in Psalms, Hymns, and Spiritual Songs. And this draws quite a bit from Psalm 51, which David wrote after his sin with Bathsheba. And so as we are looking at this man after God's own heart, and we're going to see his ascending the throne, see some of the things that are happening in his life and even his failure, we're going to see his response each time is to go back to God. And so let's sing this song as we think about David, but then also think of ourselves and our own sin and how we need to respond to sin. Brother Thomas is going to lead us in this song.
Search me, O God, and know my heart today. Try me, my Savior, know my thoughts, I pray. See if there be some wicked way in me. Cleanse me from every sin and set me free. I praise thee, Lord, for cleansing me from sin. Fulfill thy word and make me pure within. Fill me with fire where once I burned with shame. Grant me desire to magnify thy name. Lord, take my life and make it wholly thine. Fill my poor heart with thy great love divine. Take all my will, my passion, self, and pride. I now surrender, Lord, in me abide.
Thank you, Thomas. That song, just the tune that goes with the words, always makes me think of barbershop. So Alan would definitely be able to give us some help there. So as we think through this first section of 2 Samuel, chapters 1 through 12, we do see kind of the rise of David now that he has no competition from Saul. Though he's still going to have some competition from the son of Saul, we're going to see that God continues to stay with David and to strengthen him and give him the throne. But as we continue, let's remember that a lot of times we should think of the first and second books in the Old Testament as one book, and they were divided up. And so we have 1 Samuel in our Bibles, and 2 Samuel goes back to probably the Greek translation, the Septuagint, that started to divide things up a little bit more. But here, just viewing Samuel as a unit, it flows directly from chapter 31 of 1 Samuel. And so when you read chapter 1 of 2 Samuel, what do you find? What's the main idea of 2 Samuel chapter 1?
Yes, shoot the messenger.
Shoot the messenger, yeah. Very good. Yeah, mourning. I labeled it as a lament because we actually have an emphatic phrase here that to chant a lament, David does that, and I think it's actually the same, if I remember right, it's been earlier this week that I looked at it, or last week that I looked at it, but I think it's cognate there between the verb and the noun. He lamented a lament, literally, and so you have kind of this emphatic use in the original. So I chose this word lament to kind of portray chapter 1. And the way I would remember chapter 1 is just, if I can remember chapter 31, where you have the death of Saul, and that was the end of Saul's story, now we have the beginning of David's story. So the first chapter is the beginning of David's story, and what's he doing? He is mourning over the death of the Lord's anointed. So you have this lament in chapter 1, where he is, of course, against the Amalekite who brings this news of Saul's death. We'll talk about that more in the discussion. He's sorrowful, he mourns, and then he chants a lament in honor of Saul and Jonathan. When we get to chapter 2, what do we find?
War between two
Very good. And so I use two words, civil war. You have civil war between Israel and Judah, in essence. And so chapter 2, you have two kings. Chapter 2, two kings. Those two kings are David and Ishbosheth. So David and Ishbosheth, two kings, chapter 2, are at odds with one another, civil war between the parts of the nations. All right? Chapter 3, we still have this ongoing war, but David is becoming stronger and stronger. And yet we have a character that was connected to Saul, is now connected to Ishbosheth, who is kind of the focus of this chapter. And who is that? Abner. Very good, Abner. Now, Saul is the son of whom? Kish, who is of Benjamin. Very good. But we have that connection to Ner, and then Abner would be the father of Ner, and so you have some connections there just by name. But most of the time, whenever we look at Saul and David, we're going to find that there's a lot of family connections in the government. And so we have Abner here, who has tried to help Ishbosheth, and yet, what happens between Ishbosheth and Abner? Very good. So there's conflict because he goes into one of the concubines, which, as we're going to see, as we already saw with Absalom, as we're going to see in 1 Kings, that can be viewed as an attempt on the throne. If you are going into the harem of the king, to the concubine of the king. And so you have this conflict between Abner and Ishbosheth, and Abner says, what are you angry for? Who do you think I am that you can try to get angry and treat me like this? And so then he goes off, and what does he try to do with David? Yeah, make a covenant. We have, if you want to think of it this way, almost a conspiracy against Israel, where he says, I'll come over to you, I'll deliver the kingdom over to you. And how does David respond to that? Yeah, he says, all right, let's go with this. And yet, his military leader has been off, and when Joab comes back, how does Joab feel about Abner? Threatened? Yes, bad blood because of what he did to his brother, and so Joab isn't on board with this alliance. And then what does Joab do to Abner? Murders him. And how does David feel about that? Very good. And we'll talk about that some more in the discussion, but the way I would remember Abner in chapter 3 is that we have three angry men. Chapter 3, three angry men, Abner, Joab, and David. And so we have Abner mad at Ishbosheth, Joab mad at Abner and David, and then David mad at Joab because of the events that unfold in chapter 3. All right, now when we get into chapter 4, so Abner's out of the picture, but who's still left? Ishbosheth. So chapter 4 seems to be somewhat of a focus on Ishbosheth. And what happens to Ishbosheth in chapter 4?
Murdered in his house.
Yeah, murdered in his palace. And so if we want to try to remember chapter 4 is we have more death, more murder. We have the death of Ishbosheth, and now there is going to be this consolidation of power by David as we get to chapter 5. So chapter 5 I would label as the coronation of David. We've already had him set up as king by Judah, but now we're going to have him over all of Israel in chapter 5. And so I think it is almost close to rhyming. Chapter 5, you have the tribes, 5 tribes assemble for coronation. All the tribes of Israel assemble for the coronation of David. So now that we have the civil war over, the household of Saul kind of put in its place, we have David over all the tribes, Judah and Israel. Notice, as we've already said before, even way back in Judges, we're seeing some seeds of division all the way through this between Israel and Judah. It keeps popping up, and anytime there's a major conflict, they're quick to just separate, which is going to come up again after the time of peace with Solomon. A little bit of problem, boom, they separate from one another once again. Any comments or questions on the first 5 chapters? On the overview here. All right, when we get to chapter 6, what's one of David's first kind of religious projects that he wants to take upon himself? He wants to move the ark. He wants to move the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. It has been in the sacred place. I need to look at, is it Shiloh or is it Gibeon at the time? I'll have to look back at that. Maybe someone can help me out if you remember. But he is going to, maybe Kiriath Jearim actually, but he is going to remove the ark down to Jerusalem because he has sent up his own kind of tabernacle of sorts, kind of a temporary tabernacle. And then we're going to see eventually he wants to have a temple built. And then finally, Solomon is going to take the real tabernacle and the altar and the rest of the sacred objects and going to bring all of it to the temple. So eventually we're going to get there, but right now we're just moving the ark to Jerusalem, to the city of David. And what is significant about David's movement of the ark in chapter 6? Sorry? He doesn't do it right to start with. How does he move the ark? Exactly. He gets a new cart, just like the Philistines had back in the time of the judges. And how were you supposed to move the ark? Yeah, on the shoulders of the priest, you put the rods through the rings, and they were to carry it. They were the only ones who were supposed to carry it. Now, of course, you have, because they didn't move it the right way, what happens to someone as it's moving toward Jerusalem? Yeah, Uzzah puts his hand against it, and he is struck dead. How does David feel about that?
He's angry at first, and then he realizes that he did wrong.
Right.
He was very afraid.
Right. And then finally, they start doing it the right way by having the priest carry it on the rest of the way to Jerusalem, take it out of the house of Obed-Edom, and they get it there the way they should. Kevin?
Good example of the best intentions not being acceptable.
Yeah.
Because what's only acceptable is what God says is acceptable. You carve it, that's your best. Don't let it fall, that's your best. But that's not what God said. Sometimes the only thing you consider is whether God said it or not. That's what makes things right or wrong.
Right. It's almost like God is not just concerned about intentions and ends, as he is also concerned about means as well. When God says how he wants something done, that's how he wants something done. So the way I would remember chapter 6 is because of their putting it on the new cart, chapter 6, they should have used sticks. They should have used the rods through the rings in order to carry the ark down to Jerusalem. So chapter 6 is the ark story and how they should have transported it, how they eventually transported it, and it comes to Jerusalem. When you get to chapter 7, what happens?
David says that he would like to build God a house, because he's dwelling in a paneled house. Why doesn't God have the same sort of thing? And of course, Nathan has to come and disabuse, or is it Gad? One of them. One of those seniors that he had hanging around came and said, no, actually God wants something different from you, but he will build you a house.
Very good. And with that promise in view, I labeled chapter 7, you have the covenant, often called the Davidic covenant, the covenant with David here in chapter 7. This is going to be a key point, and you might be slightly disappointed as we move through the discussion here in this lesson, because I don't talk a lot about chapter 7. That's only because I'm holding it off till the New Testament connections section of our lessons. And so just be patient when we're at the discussion. We will talk about the Davidic covenant, even if it seems a little underwhelming here as we move through the first initial discussion. So chapter 7, you have this covenant where God promises to build a house for David. And so you have this promise from heaven, 7 heaven, promise from heaven that there would be a line of David, a kingship. I almost labeled this as that chapter 7, there will be a king from heaven from the line of David. So you can kind of go either way you want. All right. Any comments or questions about anything so far? Chapter 8, what happens there? What do we get a recounting of in chapter 8?
I think the Lord is with David, and he does what the Lord told him to do. He's defeating the enemies.
Very good. And so we might label this as the victories. God is with him, and he is winning very many victories at this time. So it's kind of interesting that God says, you can't build this house because you are a man of war. And in the very next chapter, well, you have to go to Chronicles to find out that you're a man of war part. But the very next chapter, we see him continuing as the warrior king in view of a time when a king of peace will come and establish the house for the Lord. So we have these victories of David. So chapter 8, David's great. He is securing the borders. He is extending the borders. He is winning these battles against all their enemies because God is with him. All right, chapter 9. What do we have in chapter 9? Mephibosheth. Very good, Mephibosheth. And who is Mephibosheth? Yeah, Jonathan's crippled son. And what's the story with David and Mephibosheth in this chapter?
Seeking someone he can show honor to, show honor to Saul's family. He's the only one left.
Very good. And why would he choose a son of Jonathan? He made a promise. They had made a covenant with one another. They would take care of each other's families. And here we have David trying to accomplish that. Mephibosheth is going to come up through the story, but here is not his introduction per se, because we actually have him mentioned previously. But now we have kind of his initial story, his interaction with David. And so chapter 9, we have the line of Jonathan blessed by David. Chapter 9, the line of Jonathan blessed by David. All right, after this section, was there a comment there? All right. When we get to chapter 10, what's the story in chapter 10?
War with the Ammonites and the Syrians, which I love the conclusion, at least the way the New King James renders it. So the Syrians were afraid to help the people of Ammon anymore.
Yeah, that's a good verse. So yes, we have this kind of war with Ammon, and of course the Ammonites bring in the Arameans, the Syrians, is kind of to help them in these battles. And after David gets done with them, they're not willing to help the Ammonites anymore. The way I remember this one would be chapter 10 rhymes with Ammon. Chapter 10, Ammon. That's the story of David's victory over the Ammonites. All right, so we have David has won this civil war. God's been with him. He's been crowned king by all the northern and southern nations or northern and southern sections of Israel. He's winning all these battles. He's blessed his enemies. He is stopping anyone who comes against him. And then we get to chapter 11, and what happens? We have the sin with Bathsheba. And we'll talk more about this in the discussion, but this is, of course, the great downfall of David. This is the thing that keeps on being brought up again. David wholeheartedly served the Lord, except. And sometimes, though David is forgiven, you have remembrance, you have consequences associated with sin for the rest of your life, and even beyond your life, and that's what it is for David. But of course, this is not just to drag David's name through the mud because God is exalting him. It is to say God has forgiven him, and we can learn from this failure of David so that we don't make the same mistakes. So chapter 11, if 10 rhymes with Ammon, 11 rhymes with sin. 11, sin with Bathsheba. Chapter 11 is the sin with Bathsheba. All right, we'll talk more about that story in the discussion. Chapter 12, kind of a continuation of chapter 11. What happens in chapter 12? Sorry? Nathan confronts him. So God sends Nathan, the prophet. I don't know if there's any significance to Nathan's name, but Nathan in Hebrew means to give. And so we have him giving a rebuke to David. But we have Nathan here telling him about his sin. We have that famous story of the parable, if you will, of the lamb, of the poor man and the rich man taking that lamb. And David's rebuke, we'll talk about his anger and his punishment that he metes out to this person or this hypothetical person before he says, "You are the man." But chapter 12, in essence, what Nathan is saying is you need to take care of this sin. You have sinned against God, and so I couldn't think of anything better. But chapter 12, he needs to shelve that sin. He needs to take care of that problem. So chapter 12, shelve this sin. We'll talk about that prophecy in just a moment, or maybe next time, sorry. Any comments or questions on the overview? It's interesting that this first half of 2 Samuel, you start with a lament for the death of a sinner, and you're going to end with a lament because David has become a sinner. And then we'll see the consequences all the way through the rest of the book. All right. In chapter 1, way back in chapter 1 of 2 Samuel, after the death of Saul, David returns from fighting with whom? The Amalekites. Very good. With Amalek. Saul's been fighting with the Philistines. David has been saved from that battle to fight with Amalek, and we have him kind of doing what Saul could not do. Who reports the death of Saul to David? Amalekite. Isn't that interesting? So we're already having some conflict of interest here. I don't know what the intentions of this Amalekite are as he comes to David. Maybe he knows what's happened to the Amalekites. Maybe he's trying to get in good with this king who has defeated them. But regardless, and we'll talk about, I don't know if we'll have time to talk about it or not, but you have to wonder if this is the truthful story or if this is kind of an embellishment. Either way, he has pronounced himself as one who did not respect the Lord's anointed, whether Saul was dead already or whether he actually killed him. But he thinks this is good news for David. Look, I've killed the king, the one that you were against. And how does David respond to the report? Violently. Very good. What are some other emotions you see listed there? Very good. So we have violence, we have anger, sorrow. We also have sorrow intermingled in this, and thus leading to the lament after the death of the Amalekite. Why does David respond this way? We have to kind of think about this maybe a little bit, but why would he respond this way concerning Saul and Jonathan?
Because he loved the Lord.
Mm-hmm. He loved the Lord. What else might it say?
Despite all that Saul was doing to him, he was the Lord's anointed.
Right? He respected the office.
And I think he also loves Israel. And
Mhm.
David tell it not in Gath. David won't know ill or anything to do with God or Israel.
Right. Very good. All right, we'll stop there and start with number 2 next Sunday. And so I appreciate everyone's participation.